progressives, it means their quest to delete the church's stance against homosexuality has failed.
Let us vote for what is God's will.
60% of gay and lesbian people claim some religious affiliation, and mostly Christian, despite everything that's happened.
The Roman Catholic Church is categorically opposed to any attempt to legalize same-sex unions because she teaches infallibly, with the authority of the Son of God, that homosexual acts, not persons, actions, not persons, are a grave depravity, intrinsically disordered and contrary to nature.
This must be recognized for what it is. Sin. Serious sin, damning sin, destructive sin.
I've been in lots and lots and lots of settings with lots of friends and lots of people who have same-sex relationships, and it's not destructive, and it's not evil, and it's a part of how churches are.
It is time for Christians who love the Bible to stand up and proclaim that the God they know and worship does not condemn LGBT people, and that homosexual sex is no more sinful than heterosexual sex.
Today I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, a father, a born-again evangelical Christian, and a proud gay man.
So, Doubts Aloud listeners, you can pretty well hear what the subject in this episode is going to be about. That was a clip from the YouTube series I did some years ago now on lots of Christian diverse subjects where there's internal Christian debates. And this is one very big one, the debate on homosexuality and Christianity. And so today we're going to look at that, and we're going to look into some aspects of the depth and the background about it. And so before I pass over to Ed and Francis to continue on this, just wanted to say, I just read out a little bit about this subject of homosexuality and the Christian faith, and the debate that happens within Christianity in many different places. So I've got a summary here of the subject of homosexuality in the church and the Bible, and it goes like this. There are 7 texts often cited by Christians to condemn homosexuality: Noah and Ham, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Levitical laws condemning same-sex relationships, 2 words in the New Testament lists, 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, and Paul's letter to the Romans, Romans 1. The author believes that these do not refer to homosexual relationships between 2 free, adult, and loving individuals. They describe rape or attempted rape, cultic prostitution, male prostitution, and pedestry. And so that is an example of one particular Christian summary of the relevant text and an interpretation. And we're today going to go in on the validity or not of perhaps some of those interpretations. And so now I've done that preamble. Ed and Francis, can you pick up?
I'm a bit reluctant to be the judge of what Christians ought to believe.
Okay.
But I'm happy to do a survey and sort of whip through of some of these key passages and just to see where we've got to where we are. And then I'm keen also to have a look at the worldwide view as well of other religions and history. Francis, I think, done a bit of work on actually what was the attitudes before the Bible or within the Bible culture.
So, well, before that, Francis, what did you both think of the audio that we played before with these diverse, you can just see Christians from all stripes saying vastly different things. What did you make of that?
Well, I think there is an element of people interpret the Bible in accordance with an existing zeitgeist, I guess I'd say. And the fact that we have come to see gay sexuality as being perfectly acceptable has motivated people to take different interpretations to the conservative one. Of course, you're always going to get some conservatives who have the same one, but that's the way I see it. And I see it as a bit like slavery, that at one time there was a lot of agreement that the Bible made it okay to have slaves, and then people came along and sort of said, oh, no, you've got to understand what it said about slavery in the context of its time, and it wasn't really saying that slavery was okay. And they're sort of doing rather, slightly the opposite with homosexuality, that they're saying, whereas modern Christians say the Bible never said slavery was okay, they're now saying the Bible never said homosexuality wasn't okay.
Yes.
Sort of.
I think there is some of that going on, and I have a very sort of nuanced understanding of it. I'm sure you do, Ed, as well. And that before we get into the depths of this, just to sort of broaden, to sort of maybe put if any Christian people are listening here, sort of thinking, I don't know much about the subject, or you do, I would break the ideas down to exactly what you just said, Francis, that there are conservative ideas that the Bible for thousands of years has or people have believed that the Bible has condemned homosexual relationships, and therefore you cannot be like an active homosexual and an active Christian. They just do not go together. That's been a pretty much standard view right the way through. But then there's been a sort of, if you're in the Christian camp and you're more progressive, say, then you may seek, just as you were saying, Francis, that actually we need to we kind of know that there's something wrong here, so have we interpreted it right, so we go back now, so that's one view, and we go back and reinterpret it, and some of the reinterpretations seem really stretching it. That could be seen as that response. Then you get more people who don't have a particular conservative view of the Bible, and they could be quite liberal Christians or agnostic and atheists, and see that the Bible was written in its own time. It's a human book. It's evolving. It had different authors. That there's condemnations of it, and then there's as we move on, like from slavery or women not being allowed to preach, you move on from that captured moment in the Bible, and we're into a different place now, and you can be a Christian and an active sort of homosexual or gay. So they're the three kind of camps that people sort of move around in. What surprised me when I studied this, because at college I actually wrote a paper on this in Bible college, and what surprised me was that the condemnable texts, the ones that condemn homosexuality, have so much potential to go different ways that they're not quite condemning what we think of today as a homosexual relationship. And so sometimes that's like a scholarly view of the text as opposed to a Christian who's trying to get out of clear text. And other aspects of trying to say that, it was always fine and Jesus would have loved gay people in gay relationships at the time is also a stretch the other way. So that would be my broad picture of how people have seen this before we move on. Ed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think people are strongly guided by how they interpret the Bible on all sorts of matters. So the more evangelical conservative types will always treat the Bible, if it says something clearly, then that's it. Whereas a liberal will tend to say, the details of they're slightly barking up the wrong tree, but the overall picture of love and acceptance of people and forgiveness, that's of course all great. So there is a big scale on how much you allow your modern sensibilities or your just your own thinking to guide how you interpret the Bible. And I think it's legit whatever position you have, but it's people who really value the Bible as the inspired word of God, and God was deeply involved in every word written. They are the ones who often reluctantly, in my view, have an anti-gay stance. They would much prefer to have a pro-gay stance, because if they, like the rest of us, really can't see what the problem is.
Yes, that's right. I suppose it gets interesting because, like, those that want to have women, say, minister in the church or be ministers and priests or whatever, do have, sometimes you have face value plain texts that stare you right in the face. I permit not a woman to teach or have authority because Eve in the creation was deceived. And there seems to be some plain text as you read them face value. But somebody who believes in women in ministry, for example, has to work with that very plain text and be very serious with it, but also see what's plainly written in front of them. And this is the same thing we get with this. So there are some plain texts, but on the other hand, there's plain text about slavery, isn't there? You are allowed to buy foreign slaves and beat them and their property to be passed down for life to your family. These are plain texts in the Bible. So I think plain texts often, with a more thoughtful Christian, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know what I mean? Otherwise, we'd all be slave owners today and no women could speak, you know.
Yes,
And,
the plain text
so,
in the New Testament is much more, has a much more credence than plain text in the Old Testament.
We could buy all our slaves from France because you're told to buy them from surrounding countries.
Yes, that's right. Well, even in the New Testament one was with women, I permit not a woman to teach have authority, based on the created order of Eve being deceived. So that's part of the fall, before the fall, if you know what I mean, or caused the fall, is a New Testament text in 1 Timothy. And so people that are absolutely fine with women not being priests and who can't even teach or preach, they go, there we are, the plain word of God, you know. But most people that I know don't take that plainness, and it's the same with some of these texts as we read Romans 1 later and everything else. And so I think I can only come in a bit later in this podcast on how the power of some of the condemnable texts don't actually quite have the whop that they had. But I'll tell you the conclusion of my essay later. Based on this, but I was surprised actually about what I read in depth on some of these verses.
Okay. Yeah. With my sort of semi-depth, I didn't do surface reading. I did look a little bit more.
Yes.
What
we're deep divers here on Doubts Aloud.
I concluded that a couple of texts were very difficult to wriggle out of if you take the Bible as God's word overall. Oh dear. I think we've lost Frances forever now. She was sounding a bit.
I think Frances was having technical problems. And so I think she said that she can't carry on with this conversation for this episode, but she will be back. We're going to do a part 2, and she will do an in-depth background to sexuality and homosexuality in the ancient Near East. And so that will be for a part 2 next time. So from here on in, it's me and you, Ed.
Yeah, sorry.
And if I have technical problems, it's just going to be you. so Custer's last stand. Okay, So where can we go from here?
Well, I think we could do a kind of Bible nerdy thing where we pretend to be conservatives, looking at where in the Bible someone keen to follow Jesus with a very high view of the Bible will conclude probably that homosexuality is a no-no, and where it's really not saying that.
Yes.
Because in your survey of about 7 texts, I would add at least one more. We could whip through some of them, because some of them, you know, however conservative you are, if you're actually a Bible scholar, you'll think, no, this is not saying that at all. Let's move on.
Yes, that's right. I mean, what I have in my sort of research of this subject found that there is a strange bedfellow between the sort of fundamentalist reader of the Bible and the critical scholar, actually, and i.e. both actually do read the text and try to understand the text in its plain meaning, at least at first. And but the critical scholar kind of looks, I would say, a lot more in with the surrounding cultural context, not just the textual context, you know, the flow of it. And so that actually can give nuances that are quite different in some ways. And when we get on to Sodom, for example, there were some real surprises I found in some of these verses when you look at them critically, right even to Romans 1. So so let's start with, what do you want to start with?
Well, let's start with I'd like to leave Genesis 1 and 2 until Jesus talks about them. So we'll start with the stories in Genesis with Sodom and Gomorrah, and there was another one you mentioned.
Yes. Well, it's a Noah and Ham situation which has been used. There's the Leviticus 18 and 20 kind of verses. And then there's the context, not only the ancient Near East, but the context of those verses themselves that need obviously looking at.
But I mean, we can just dismiss a lot because of just because of something horrible happens in the Old Testament doesn't mean it's endorsed.
Yeah, I suppose so. And it's interesting on the surrounding verses of some of these, particularly Leviticus 1, why. Well, when we get to that, we'll do it. So let's look at Sodom then. So how would you start talking?
Well, I say nothing to see here. The condemnation of Sodom was the horrible rape thing.
Yeah,
really.
I mean,
so the what happened was these angels visited Lot, and he, who's a brother-in-law, I think, or something of Abraham.
Abraham, yeah.
And he didn't quite know who they were, but he was a good egg, and he looked after them. Then the men of
all the men, the whole
all
town.
the men of Sodom came to his door, asking basically to have the guests to be raped all night.
Yes.
And Lot, astoundingly, offered his daughters,
I think, two
daughters.
Yeah.
Fortunately, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
I forget what did happen, but in the end, I don't think anyone was harmed in the making of this story, until God punished them for it all.
Yeah.
And it wasn't. I mean, it's called sodomy I think even in the King James Bible, homosexuality is called sodomy.
Yeah.
But it wasn't actually that was the problem.
No. It's all to do with hospitality.
If you just treat it as on face value, read it all through, you're not going to get the understanding that God's got a massive problem with homosexuality, and that was what the issue was. It was a lot else.
Well, I think it's quite clear in some of the other passages in the Old Testament, and even allusions in the New Testament, in Jesus in the Gospels, about the hospitality and the treatment. I forget the actual wording now in some of the others, but the sin of Sodom is actually in Ezekiel named, I believe, and there's Isaiah. It's to do with mistreatment of other people, and part of that was the honor of not treating guests well, and it's not. It's the way it's actually written. You would have thought that's a surprise. Why did it say the sin of Sodom was this when we all know it's homosexuality? And it doesn't seem to do that. Do you have the quote to hand of the sin of Sodom?
No, I think there's some quotes in one of the prophets that explain.
So it's the sin of Sodom in. We can actually probably look that up.
This isn't a deep dive, apparently.
No. But certainly the references to the sin of Sodom isn't. Well, first of all, it's a very unusual story, because you've got, where people talk about this, 5% perhaps of people of the world is like homosexual or of communities, maybe. You've got the whole town. Everybody is like so cool. If you're going to see it as homosexuals, it's all the men. So there's not women mentioned here. And they all come out and they want to sort of know, as it says, know these guests who we know are angels. And whether they knew that they were sort of some kind of angels as well is another debated question, actually. But even so, the very notion that they are all in a sort of a situation that doesn't speak to a homosexual couple in any sense. That is gang called rape, really, isn't it?
Yes.
And not only that, Lot says, "Don't do this to my honourable guests. Have my daughters," and that's a shocking thing to our culture. I don't think that.
But Lot didn't get. He didn't get.
He's not that. He's not a baddie in the narrative, because I think that we don't necessarily understand the value of the treatment of guests, even over family members, and it's like abhorrent to us to think, "Oh my gosh, how can he offer his daughters? What kind of moral guy is this?" But I think in the way the narrator is writing it in the culture of the time, this is sort of lesser of two evils. Have my daughters. But it does show you that if these men can go from men to women, even in rape, first of all, it's rape and it's power and it's abuse, and it's both sexes. So how that can then be lifted up and say, homosexuality in terms of a couple today can be applied directly from that is really misusing, I think, which is what you're saying. And if I could get the quotes from, I'll probably find them towards the end, that the sin of Sodom is actually said to be in the Old Testament. I think I've got it here, actually. Now, this is in Ezekiel. Now, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Now, I suppose somebody could read into that and say, okay, but the fact is the emphasis is on the unconcerned, and that's very interesting because the Sodom passage itself talks about they weren't, he had to honor these guests. And so
and they had it coming. Sodom had it coming way before these angels turned up as Lot's guests. It was already said that God was going to punish it.
That's right. And maybe the detestable, the essence of the detestable things could be that, but the detestable things even then could be the rape of anybody in a gang rape situation.
Yeah.
And I've always puzzled over the fact is, what do you mean the whole town? Everybody was just like, what kind of place is this? It just seems like a shocking way to put it. And then, of course, we are talking about a type of God that then rains down actual fire on people, Oh, by the way, about Lot, of course, but didn't Lot survive this with his daughters? And they thought they were the only ones left and no one. So his daughters had sex with him to have children.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting whole story, this one. So anyway, so I wouldn't, but there is an allusion though to this story in the New Testament though. Did you know much about that? That's Jude.
Jude, I haven't looked at that. I'll look the verse up now.
Yeah, that's Jude 1:7. So it's possible, and again, from our point of view of the Bible, things evolve, people have different views. It's possible that Jude, and by the time you get to the very unusual book of Jude, by the way, it doesn't seem to be, it's a very strange book, and it had a very strange, it talks about strange things and doesn't kind of fit a lot in the way the New Testament reads in other ways. It's a strange book, I'd say. But it talks about giving themselves up to strange flesh and immorality and all the rest of it. But again, it doesn't have the power that one might think. If it does, it means that by the time we get to the New Testament era, at least maybe Jude, I think it's argued that Jude might have been a 2nd century document actually included in the Bible. And that what?
The whole thing's just a slippery octopus.
Well, it's just that if we do get anything, it's by then that they then look back at Sodom and they start to get this link between the sexual immorality of Sodom rather than their lack of care for the poor. So something's changed, but it may not be, because there is the possibility that when they went after strange flesh, there's the interpretation that the strange flesh is angelic. Not, yes. So therefore, if that's a possibility, you can't really stand up as a preacher, can you? And you say, the Bible says maybe you are condemned here, because it says in Sodom that it could be angels, but it could be men. If it's, we know. So when you all these power passages like this and we'll go through this a bit more. A lot of them don't have the power that I don't have the power, Captain. It sounds like Star Trek. They don't have the power that those that are so strong against it would use these verses. If you're going to be against homosexuality, you need a bigger picture than just some of these verses as sticks. And I think you can get a bigger picture, but it's not done with these verses. So that's the Sodom one then.
Well, I just want to just finish off by saying,
sorry,
in Genesis 19, that's when Sodom gets clobbered.
Mm-hmm.
But right back in Genesis 13,
it
says, now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 6 chapters earlier.
Yeah.
And then when the story of Sodom gets going, leading up to that, it says, where was it? The Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin is so grievous. So that was way before any of this happened.
And of course, when Ezekiel points back to say it was their lack of care for the poor and everything else, surely that must have been an understanding that was so strong that it even got back into those later centuries to look back at Sodom and go, it's not men on men, it's all these things. And maybe this is one aspect, but even then it's more like prison rape, gang rape than anything else. So
that's the bigger crime.
That's the, so that would be, I mean, everybody would be against that, and so it's nothing to do with the modern homosexual attraction of say two people at all. And so that's where I think the power of this doesn't kind of work at all, when people use what about Sodom and Gomorrah, and I still puzzled by the whole town coming out. I mean, it must be an embellishment to sort of paint them far worse than they were, because can you imagine going to some town, you know, like Tunbridge or something, and every man comes out to try and rape you.
But we're not kind of allowing ourselves to say that. We're trying to say let's pretend that we are earnest Christians trying to do our best. What actually is the Bible saying? In this case, it's not saying that.
It's not really. It doesn't have the power. So we need to say, where do we get the next power from?
And we do have to just clarify, in case we haven't already, that the Bible says nothing at all about same-sex attraction. It only talks about sexual acts.
Yes, that's right.
Bad.
And therefore, it's a different understanding of how we perhaps are today. And you could, perhaps a liberal critic or somebody would say that the Old Testament was kind of ignorant of where we are today, in the same way that it's ignorant on, you know, is
silent on.
It's silent on. Well, maybe, yeah. But then when we go into these other passages, like I don't know, it's abomination to sow 2 lines of seed in a field or whatever. It's like hang around, or being unclean in your period and having sex, that sort of thing is like you know, something that we wouldn't really condemn these days. And so what's happening? Why the change? You know. Anyway,
can we do a real skatey bit with Leviticus laws, because if that's something that Francis needs to
go in depth on.
Yeah, we don't want to sully the waters. So clearly it condemns sexual acts between men. Doesn't mention sexual acts between women.
No.
And which I'm sure Francis will make.
There must be a reason for that, but
she will explain what the reason is.
Not addressed in the Old Testament, and it's really interesting.
But that's by the by. I'd like to just to sort of be my evangelical old self and say, well, hang on a minute. The Leviticus condemns an awful lot of stuff that we find acceptable now, famously shellfish.
Yes.
So we've got to do a little bit more work before we just say, oh, it says in Leviticus, so it's clearly wrong.
Yeah, I think it's this is a case of, we know what it says, and is there then, once we know what it says, we also know what other things say, you know. And so the question is not so much at this point what it says, but it's like, is there anything we're missing from ancient context anyway? That's probably the next question. So once we've read what it is there any contextual stuff that might inform us if a straight reading is as clear as we think? So that's one thing.
Well, let's assume a straight reading's fine.
Okay.
But I think the question is, how it's been put, which I don't think is established scholarship now, is that there were 3 kinds of law in the Old Testament.
Right.
Ceremonial law, civil law, and sort of religious, well, I don't know what we'll call it, law that matters.
Yeah.
So people would try to say that this is a law that matters. It's not just ceremony, and it's not to do with kind of civil society. I don't think that can be said anymore with modern, well, not even just modern scholarship, just people doing.
I think I've read an awful lot of different scholars that would say you just cannot make this separation.
Exactly.
Like Catherine Hayes says that, she goes a little bit further in one sense, not just say that they're just unclean or ritual laws, but she's saying that legal, what is moral in God's sight is legal in God's sight. What's legal is moral, and it's all together in one go. So if you were to read Leviticus all the way through, they are, and you've got, I don't know, there's other verses that we can read that are just as punishable by either death or being cut off from your people, which could or could not mean death anyway. And they're all abominations for the whole list, it says at the end of Leviticus. You can't just pick and say, you'd have to say that in the time, the way it reads is that all these things were abominations and perversions or whatever, and unclean and whatever, and you have to take it as a whole. This breakup seems to be a bit of special pleading, at least by picking the text apart and saying that's fine to do now, that's completely immoral for all time. That was just for the time with the Jews. This is all time for all human beings. I think that that's just not even in Leviticus to say that.
But if you're a good Bible believer,
yeah,
not interested in scholarship at all,
yes,
you will read the Book of Acts and Peter having his vision of the unclean animals, which are unclean because they're said as much in Leviticus and other Torah books.
Yeah.
And the command was go kill and eat, I think was the exact phrase. So it's absolutely clear, if you are a Bible follower, that there are parts of Leviticus, speaking of these kind of detailed laws, which are not supposed to apply to you as a Christian.
That's right. But I've actually heard pro-homosexual people, in terms of even scholarly kind of people sometimes, who are on the side of pro-gay, actually use this argument. They use the same thing as what you just said, except in the context, all of these things, the problem is with that is then bestiality would probably be all right. You know what I mean? But certainly what God has made, in other words, God can, I've heard people actually use this kind of argument that God can change, like he wanted his people, these are all abominations, and now you can be a Christian and not do any of those things, and it's okay. If you know what I mean. Sorry, you can do some of these things, i.e. plant 2 different seeds, wear trousers, women can wear trousers, and it's not a sin. All of this
and
stuff.
Even something quite close in, I think, location in the Bible and subject matter, the issue of whether you are allowed to have sex with your partner when she's having her period.
Well, exactly. I mean, let's just read 2. I've selected here myself 2 verses from Leviticus. So I'm going to read the 2. They come literally 3 verses from each other. So they're in this passage that's being read out. And this is
chapter 18?
Chapter 18, yeah. So I've got one of them. The first one is verse 18, I believe. And it's, if a man has sexual relations with a woman during her monthly period, he has exposed the source of her flow, and she has also uncovered it. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. Now, cut off is actually interpreted sometimes differently with people, but it's often meant death. Even if it meant like cut off, they wouldn't survive anyway, and they would sort of die. And even in Daniel, the anointed one is cut off, and that's always interpreted as death. You know what I mean? And so, anyway, even at the very end, it says, after the whole list of Leviticus 18, it says, "Whoever does any of these abominations, those persons shall be cut off from the people." So it's talking about the next one I'm going to read, verse 22. "You shall not sleep with a male as one sleeps with a female. It is an abomination." We've just had that.
Yeah.
And so also, "You shall not have sexual intercourse with any animal to defile it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion." So what's interesting on this, to be fair, is that you've got, the male to male homosexual, you've got nothing about lesbianism, but you have got women with animals here, which is interesting. Very interesting, by the way, when I talk about Romans 1 later, and a possible interpretation. But what you've got then is suddenly, so most Christians that I know who'd read this, they would say, you can't be cut off or put to death, or it's an abomination with sexual relations with a woman during a monthly period. It just can't be right. And certainly they're not going to follow it. I don't know anyone who does. Maybe there is a church out there that does that. It wouldn't surprise me if there's a church out there. At least they'd be consistent. But then on the other hand, you've got...
But they're not being consistent with Peter's vision and the...
you mean, sorry, if they did follow this, they're consistent here, but they're not consistent with the unclean animals being allowed, whatever. But some people, like I've said, have taken that thing in Peter and applied it to even homosexuals. Like God changed his mind, that this was a category in the old, for the Jews. It was like, you can't. And by the way, did you pick up this thing in your research about a lot of this theme in Leviticus is mixing categories? And that's what one of the problems is. It's like, you shall not sleep with a male as one sleeps with a female. It's an abomination because it's a mixing of categories. It's male with male instead of male with female. Equally, you should not sow 2 kinds of seed in the field, in the same field. That's a mixing of categories. With the animal, it's a mixing of categories. I don't know how sexual relations with a monthly period, that's sort of an unclean thing. But there's a lot of
But
mixing.
they're all thrown in together, along with sacrificing your children to Molech.
Yes, exactly.
It's all in the same list.
It suddenly comes up, doesn't it? Don't sacrifice your children to, and then don't. I think wear women's apparel, if that's one version of it. Where you can't swap clothes or whatever. It's mixing of categories. So there does seem to be this distinction between not only Israel and the nations, but Israel of having all these things that say we don't mix.
Yeah.
And yet the new covenant, most Christians do not abide by so many of these, which leads to a theology to try and segregate them and say all of these, are okay, and all of these are complete heinous sins, and are eternal. And that's where I think the wiggle room comes in, to say there's not a consistency. And of course, the biggest thing is that if you're going to be literally applying this now, what happened to the death penalty? What happened to being cut off from your community? At least in this age, there isn't many people that advocate the death penalty for used to, didn't you? Homosexuality.
Yes, quite modern.
That's right.
You
used to, but it certainly didn't get the death penalty for sexual relations during your monthly period, which you should do if you're going to follow that. So the problem is that if you're going to be, in no uncertain terms, homosexuality is condemned. In no uncertain terms, you have to be put to death.
Yeah.
So
I would say my kind of earnest evangelical self from 30 years ago would validly say we just can't get what we're looking for from these chapters. It's all a bit unclear. God has chosen to leave it unclear for us. So let's look elsewhere for guidance.
Yeah. Or you just have to perplex, and you can say it was as important as for God. It was moral and legal for God to really, really see as an abomination to mix two seeds in a field, and he's just as angry at that as he is at male sleeping with a male. That's hard for anyone to get their mind around.
Yeah,
today.
that sounds to me more like a serious Bible scholar who's looked into the history of it all.
Yes,
rather than I think this is probably Francis' territory.
Okay, so we'll probably do that in part 2 and get more depth on this. Okay, so
I think that's it now. We've done the Old Testament. Except sort of more references to Sodom.
Yeah, there is another reference to make, and that's that there's a similar Sodom story in Judges, is it? Where
that's right.
Where
yes.
it's this time they're wanting to do the guests and the guests that the guy has. It
seems to be consciously following the story.
It's so uncanny, because why would the whole thing just sort of mirror it in almost 6 or 7 points? And in this case, he offers the wife and the daughter. So there's this, again, you must treat these people so well. I don't think that the writer thinks that any of those characters, Lot or the other one, are actually otherwise it doesn't come in saying these are morally abhorrent people for offering their daughters. In the culture, it was morally abhorrent to treat your guests this way. And so offering your daughters is like, in their culture, was like, it wasn't the biggest sin. It was like, oh my gosh, this is what we need to do to honor the people. So we don't think like that. So it's definitely a case that the Old Testament people don't think like us, and that's where it gets complicated. We can't try to think like them either now. So anyway, so we move on to the New Testament then.
Let's go with the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus reaffirming the law. But then Peter, and so it's not clear, the New Testament, as to how much the Christian is supposed to follow through on Old Testament law. So if you read the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, not one jot or tittle from the Old Testament is to be discarded. But then Peter is told to do just that in Acts. So who knows what's going on?
Yeah. Well, the author of Acts may have a different view, basically, than the author of Matthew.
Well, we're allowed to say that.
Yeah, well, that's true. Sorry, you're talking about the person who's not allowed to say that. Yeah. Okay. It's very difficult to keep slipping back into that. Yeah.
So we can't just take the Old Testament straight from one verse in Matthew that tells us to, because of clearly there's other stuff going on. So, of course, it needs to be said really, before we get too deep, that Jesus never mentioned homosexual attraction or homosexual acts of any kind.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. There, I mean, there's arguments that I think it's at Matthew 19 that word in its context, I've read several times from scholarly sort of people that word includes sort of all sexual wrongdoing, which would include homosexuality, even if it's not in there specifically. But nor is that word. It's not saying anything specific. It's just saying it's an unusual word apparently in Matthew 19, and that within the Jewish culture of the day, it would have been all these things other than marriage, you know. And so I think that might be a fair point. And this is where I think that the clout of the condemning passages doesn't have the clout that they have always thought to have, but the overriding bigger assumptions seems to me to be pretty much always heterosexuality in the assumptions of the Jewish mind all the way through and into the New Testament. So that's kind of my view, that it would be just not, they just weren't thinking like that. It would have been bad. It would have been acts, so a relationship with a man in terms of in the church, or a woman with a woman, we just wouldn't have been the way that they were, you know. And I think that, even though you could say it's an argument from silence because it's a condemnable passage we need, but actually I think it assumes heterosexuality, I think, in the Bible. So yeah,
if we have our historians sort of hats on, we would say, well, it's no surprise that Jesus doesn't talk about homosexual partners and stuff, because that just wasn't a thing. So it would have been astounding if he had spoken about it. But my kind of earnest evangelical hat, I'm saying God has chosen not to give me guidance on this using the words of Jesus that would have been authoritative, but it's not there.
Yes, unless you just take, yes, I suppose it's a little bit like he doesn't say anything about it, but of course he's against it. It does sound a little bit like he needs to spell everything out. But then again, does he talk about bestiality, as somebody would say in reaction to that? Does he say, you know, verse 22, don't have sex with animals? You know, I think that it would just be an assumption that he would follow the line of the Torah. And whatever the question would then be is, what did the Torah actually mean? Because some people argue, even for the Old Testament, that it's to do with what you temple worship and temple fertility gods and fertility, this, that, and the other, and that it isn't to do. So I mean, this is the depth that Francis will probably go into. But anyways, yes, to keep it simple.
So I would like to go back to this key verse that Jesus quotes in Matthew, and I think the same passage is in Mark's Gospel. So Genesis chapter 2 talks about Adam and Eve being created, and in that setting it says, that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And Jesus quotes this because of the importance of that final phrase, the one flesh, because he then says, what God's joined together, let not man cast asunder, using I think that's the marriage prayer book words. So Jesus is not quoting this verse to concentrate on the options of a man leaving his father and mother and being united to another bloke, or not being united to a wife at all. It's just not part of what Jesus is doing with the verse.
No, you mean that it's not really, you mean that's a powerful argument for the more positive affirmation of heterosexuality?
That's what some people who use, I have heard people, well, it was even on Unbelievable when it was discussed about 10 days ago, that I think that will definitely have a link in the show notes. That episode of Unbelievable, which I thought was very good.
There is a spanner in the works on that, and that's that the Old Testament, as it gets going, it has absolutely pure assumption of polygamy and more than one wife. Pure assumption. It doesn't sort of say, I know people try to say this thing in Genesis is talking about just the one wife, and then sin brought polygamy in, but it doesn't actually start like that. It starts with stories of Abraham having more than one wife and concubines, and it was all very much what they all did back then.
Yes, and no one got into trouble for that.
No one got into trouble
for other things.
Yeah, you get to the law, and it talks about thou shalt not commit adultery, and you go blah, 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 blah. But then there's another law that says if you have more than one wife, make sure the other's loved. Or didn't I give you, David, all these women, and now you want Bathsheba? It's like hang around. So you can have and sleep with and have sex with more than one woman, and it's okay. Yes, in the Old Testament, it does seem to be the case. Yeah. And so that's not a spanner to say homosexuality is okay, but the assumption that you're talking about one wife, one man for life from Genesis isn't necessarily what that's saying, because otherwise you would have had God say, thou shalt only have one wife because of Adam and Eve. It doesn't say that. It says, if you have more. What? You're giving a law to say how you operate with more than one wife? Yes.
Yeah.
How about the condemnation?
So the verse is clearly not saying a man must leave his father and mother and become united to one wife. He mustn't become a monk and not have a wife at all, and he mustn't either avoid polygamy. It doesn't say any of that. It just says this is a normal situation for a man to leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. But the point is that when they do, they become one flesh.
Yeah. By the way, have you ever noticed that the way we often speak about it is that the woman leaves the mother and father and joins the man?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And now you've got the man leaving another and joining the wife. That's interesting. Roger Forster pointed that out when I was in a seminar of his years ago. I've never forgotten it. And I thought, you're right. We always think of the woman who leaves, and the father hands over.
Yes, and all these patriarchal societies.
Patriarchal societies in here.
Yeah, so it's not being patriarchal.
No, and that's why Roger would love it, because it's counteractive to the patriarchy. And I love that insight. And I thought, gosh, I'd never noticed that. Yeah. But isn't it wonderful that you do see amazing things in the Bible, even after years, something pops up. A man shall leave his father and mother. Ah, okay. So, wow.
Yes.
Anyway, that's a side point.
Yes, because I've got this thing that the Old Testament is overly patriarchal, but this is
So when
swimming in a different direction.
When your daughter got married, you wouldn't have. You haven't got a son that's going to get married, but if you've got a son, and the son will leave his father and mother to go and get married. I've never thought about it and seen it and thought like that at all until this was pointed out.
Well, the kind of typical stereotype of the child who never leaves home.
Yes.
Is a man, isn't it?
Yes, that's true. Yeah. Oh, that's true. So maybe that would fit. Come on, you're 30 now. You better leave home and find a wife.
Yes, that's right. Just stop playing video games.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh dear. Become a man
and expect your mum to do your washing. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Go and get a wife to do your washing. Yeah, that's right. Oh dear.
Yep. Okay. So again, I'm saying this is it can't be used to say what people try to make it say, which is a condemnation of homosexual practice.
Just as that passage leaves it clearly to not necessarily impinge on having more than one wife, it means it can't speak to too much, but it is talking about procreation, I suppose. It says, the mother of all living and begat, and so all of that is an obvious thing of heterosexual sex. So to me, I think that the Bible generally assumes heterosexuality within the culture all through, but still, it's worth making these points.
Okay, so the next one on the list sequentially is Romans 1, and this is interesting for two reasons. One is that it includes female on female sexual activity, which is unusual. And to me, this is the first one that if I was back in my earnest evangelical self, I would definitely conclude that homosexual activity is sinful. It starts famously where the atheist is supposed to understand that God exists just by looking at the universe, and we're being completely resistant of truth if we don't go with that. So it's in apologetics, it comes up a lot, this passage,
Yes,
particularly the start of it.
yes. Mm.
So the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So I'm suppressing the truth of God, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
When I was at college and talking to other people when I studied this Romans 1 was like, somebody said to a friend of mine, said, it all boils down to Romans 1. Because once you've had all these other ones that sort of make you not be able to necessarily preach with the certainty you once had, in terms of saying the Bible says, maybe, that's the way I like. This one is the one that's really sort of, it means Paul he's not talking about in the same passage here, like all the other things, sowing seeds and all this mixed stuff in Leviticus. It's more like, wow, this is big stuff. But there's some interesting points. But what would you like to say?
Well, I just do a little tour. So
yeah.
it's a 10 or 12 verses long, and occasionally it dips in and out of same-sex sinfulness. And so it talks about desires of their sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies one another, they exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship. So that's moving on to other things. Shameful lusts, here we go. Even the women exchange natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. So I guess that's not necessarily sinful, but it's shameful. In the same way, men that also abandon natural relations with women and inflamed with lust for one another, men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. So this is clearly not just a bad idea. This is against what God wants. There's a depraved mind that goes with this. This ought not to be done. And although they know God's righteous decree, those that do such things deserve death. So, we can hardly be clearer, really.
There are some interesting things about it. For one is that I think a lot of homosexuals today, like even Christian homosexuals who in the church claim to know Jesus or whatever and believe, they read this and they would say, that's not me. I can't read myself into that, as if, because partly it looks like there's an element where if you're homosexual, that is your punishment, or that God has almost made you that way. Did you get that sort of feeling from this, that he hands you over to it and it's like you
No, I didn't read it that way, because it's very collective. It's not talking about individuals, but groups of people.
He gave them up in their lusts, whatever, to the degrading of their bodies.
So it feels like Paul is having it in for the Gentiles, really.
Yeah, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie.
Yeah, so he's talking about Greek culture.
Yeah, and I think that the homosexual, like sort of one of my best friends is gay, and she is probably one of the nicest human beings I've ever met in my life. And in terms of the nature of everything, the way she thinks, and it was a colleague at work, and I just thought, how could I ever, even as a Christian, even when I was a Christian, if I'd met her, I just couldn't possibly think of these verses and her and that lifestyle. I just couldn't possibly equate the two as being anything of things. So that's where, but that's slightly not what the Bible says. That's like, how do you equate these words with that? You know what I mean? And so, and I've got other friends as well, and who are gay, and I just cannot put them in this category of thinking, how could I see another human being as all of these words, but having said that, by the way, there is an interpretation of this I'm not sure if you've read at all, but it particularly certain versions doesn't act, but that the Old Testament doesn't refer to doesn't talk to women having sleeping with women in a sexual way. In the Old Testament, it's just the male to the male, and then it's the woman to the beast. Well, some people I've read, some scholarly people actually see this, is that if Paul had Leviticus in his mind, he may be referring to that here. He may be referring to the men on men and the women with the beast, and that the net when it says in I mean, it's not it's not a common view, but it's just like, oh, I thought that's interesting, because why does the Old Testament drop it, and why does Paul bring it up? If he's used to category mixing in the Old Testament in his thinking, it says, like, particularly when you read the bit, the women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. Okay, so that could be the Leviticus 1 to the beast. And in the same way, also the men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Now, there may be a natural way is to say, okay, women and women and men and men here. But, it is interesting with the Levitical sequence. It doesn't mention women. Is this possible that this doesn't mention lesbianism either? So if that's the case, you've got nowhere in the Bible. So suddenly, wouldn't that be funny that, okay, lesbians, okay, it's okay. But not homosexual with male to male. But probably I would say that probably the majority view isn't that it is, even though it doesn't actually say women go with women, as it does here, says men gave up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men. It doesn't actually say women committed shameless acts with women specifically. That's the point I think that this was making, which I find quite interesting when you look at Leviticus, because it doesn't say women with women either. But I wouldn't build a hill on this. I would just say, oh, that's interesting. It's just another little notch at how do we interpret this.
Yeah. But if God is behind this text, imagine there's a God and he's behind this text. He's been very sneaky to hide the fact that he thinks women on women sex is fine, but it's only,
well, it wouldn't so much sex is fine, it's just not addressed. But then equally you'd say it's not addressed. So in the Levitical code, what if a male slept with an animal? You know what I mean? So because it doesn't address that either. It says male to male, and then it says and women present themselves towards a beast. And it's like, wow, I'm fascinated by that with that particular flow. Why isn't it equal across the board? Women to women, men and women with beasts is all wrong. It doesn't actually say that, and so it doesn't mean that a man with a beast is okay. You know what I mean? At all. But I mean, I'm just saying the way it's actually written seems to be just one way for one and mentions another. But I think it's a bit of a sidetrack. It's just that the nuances on here, some people who are pro-gay look at this and say that Paul is referring to the temple sort of fertility, older man with a younger boy kind of thing. You've heard all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So that will be. But then again, just remember this, though. Just remember this. I remember this at college, thinking about this. I'm thinking, okay, if my friend was right, it all hangs basically on Romans 1, because there are two other passages, aren't there, in the New Testament?
Yeah.
But if it all hangs on Romans 1, how about when you've got Joyce Meyer and all these women preachers and everything else, and you go to 1 Timothy, I permit not a woman to teach or have authority over a man, because Eve was deceived, and we have none of this in our churches. That is as plain as this. And yet I can go to all your churches, presumably, that you went to had women who could teach over a man, presumably.
Yeah.
So what are they doing? What are they? And these are evangelicals. So and lovely ones and good ones, and ones that think that God wants them to do it. Just like you can find a homosexual in the church who thinks God is okay with their lifestyle. They have this verse to go, well, we don't quite see it like that. But that's what the women, that's what the preachers or the Pentecostals or whatever it is where women are allowed to preach. They look at that verse, I permit not a woman to teach of authority, just like in the same way men gave up men intercourse with men. Because, have you not heard that some gay men or some gay people would say, well, I never exchanged my desire for women. They would say that's not me. I've always, ever since I was young, I had attraction to men. So where is this exchange natural for unnatural in their life? I mean, because in other words, I suppose it's talking collectively. I'm not talking specific people here, but then again, how can you identify with that? If someone says, well, yeah, I was married, people that have been married and gay have often struggled in their entire marriage. And so I just think it's just not addressing the way people feel that they are. even if it's clear. Do you know what I mean? So I'm saying,
Oh yeah, of course.
you know, just like the women thing, I know that I'm called to preach as a woman in the church, but this verse doesn't sit with me, but I have to wrestle with it. But there's a battle between the way they feel they are. I feel God's calling me to preach as a woman, but I've got these texts that are stopping me. Do you know what I mean? And so I feel that there's power in that. If you and fine, you're more consistent. If you're a church that doesn't allow women to preach, fine, then you can take this verse and say this is as condemnable as that is. But if you then have wiggle room on the one in 1 Timothy, and that this one you take completely as you read it without any attempt to have another understanding, I think you're being inconsistent.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
Except there are a lot of positive verses about the Bible, women in the Bible compared with homosexuals. So
the church I was part of had massive agonies over whether women should be able to preach or not.
Exactly. That's because of these texts. They're unsettling. And there are positive words about women in the New Testament as well that are a counteractive to the negative ones. And that's a good argument because there aren't any positive ones about homosexuality.
Yeah.
So that's a fair point to make, I'd say.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So this is 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9. And both this and Romans, there's no doubt that Paul wrote them. So I'm not going to bother quite so much with Timothy, which is the last one, because it's very similar to this one, and we're not sure if Paul wrote Timothy anyway. So the whole verse, the gay section is at the end. Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men. So the English translation in the NIV appears to be completely cast iron and condemning of homosexual acts. There is a footnote which speaks to the issue. The words, this is NIV in the footnote, the words men who have sex with men translates two Greek words that refer to the passive and the active participants in homosexual acts. So this has caused some people to claim that this is about pederasty. What's it called?
Pedestry or pedestry, yeah.
Which is the Greek practice of older men taking teenage boys.
Yeah.
And the teenage boys is the passive partner and the older man's the active partner, and it's all horrible. So that is claimed to be what this is about by people who try to say that the Bible doesn't condemn homosexual activity.
I mean, this is one of the points. It seems like, when right at the beginning I read all of those basically seven sections of the Bible, passages, if you like, that refer to the condemnation of it. And they don't quite have the pulling power that perhaps we thought, particularly the Sodom one, and possibly the Jude one doesn't, and possibly Leviticus one in the context kind of doesn't. So there's kind of clear, but they're mixed in the context. This is another one. If this is possible, it's a bit like though saying to me, it's a bit like saying, now male gang rape in a prison is absolutely wrong. Does that speak to your neighbors next door that you know for years and they've lived in what looks like a great homosexual relationship for many years, just probably better than most heterosexual ones, which is probably the case in my mind. And so it's like, okay, so does the gang rape in a male jail, for example, really apply to the people next door? And I that's the argument here. It's like if this does refer to that, that's talking about something quite different, but still doesn't address the question that the whole Jewish culture and early Christians probably would have seen male on male as just not normal. You know what I mean? Heterosexuality was the assumed way. And so I still think that that's the case. So it means that all of these verses, so basically what I'm trying to say is that all these verses, you could not mention them in church and still probably make the case for general heterosexuality based on the assumptions of all the other passages in the Bible that just assume marriage and a woman and begatting and having babies, and Adam and Eve story, maybe, that it all sort of flows with that heterosexual assumption.
Yeah.
But then you have to have patriarchal assumptions as well, and polygamy assumptions. So it the pot is boiling, really, isn't it, with all kinds of thoughts. So
Yeah.
Anyway, that would be my spiel on it.
Yeah. Actually, just an interesting aside to me here. I've just listened to this week's Unbelievable show, which is about that funny revival thing going on in America. The discussion on Unbelievable about it, the person who was slightly more wary about it all, her line was, does the gospel presented at this revival thing, is it the true proper gospel? Are people being convicted of their sin? And her idea of the key aspect of the gospel that just makes it, is almost like the kind of indicator that it's not right, is have they got the biblical line on condemning homosexuality? Would you believe that?
Amazing.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that thing about that critical race theory, that if you're woolly on critical race theory, then clearly it's not the gospel. That's just astounding, because this is just not an emphasis in the Bible at all.
It's yeah, I mean, the thing is like this, is that you'll get all kinds of different Christian groups who have their version of the gospel with, I don't know, a lot of emphasis on this part or that part, repentance as a big thing compared with, you remember, do you ever hear a thing called the Lordship of Christ?
Yeah.
If you didn't preach the Lordship of Christ in your gospel preaching, then you were just preaching easy believism, which was other churches. And those that would attack Lordship people would say, you're preaching a gospel of works. And so again, back to this, I didn't have time to do that subject in my I didn't continue to do, my YouTube channel of Diverse Christian Views, which we started this episode with. I was going to go on to the Lordship debate. And so I find that what your story there is that different Christians will come along, the AIG, Ken Ham's lot will come along and say, are they preaching the foundational principles of Christianity, that the earth is young and evolution is a lie? Because that's, these young people should, so that would be key for them. Maybe not the gospel, but that would be a very key. So everyone's looking, other businesses would say, are they teaching the gifts of the Spirit and healing? Because, and the people would say, there's splits in that area. So I think it's what you've picked up there is just somebody, very surprising that that's the issue, though. I thought it would be some other issues than.
Yeah, that's right. I was astounded.
If you've got to be anti-gay to preach the proper gospel.
Yes, yeah.
Wow. That's incredible, considering we've looked at some of these verses to show complexity in it.
Exactly. That's why I was thinking even more. Yeah.
You'd have to say, well, it looks like heterosexuality is the norm, and some of these verses do sort of condemn, but we know other verses, like the other thing is, by the way, in one of my YouTube videos, I think it's the second part, I've got somebody who's saying, first of all, get your house in order. When it talks about the case for remarriage, that some people argue the Bible does not allow for remarriage. So once you're divorced, that's it. The Catholic takes that view, and other people do take that view, that in Mark, you are not to get, remarried after divorce. And that is completely swept aside by majority of Christians, particularly Protestant. You get people who remarried 10 times and it's not even an issue. And yet Jesus, you could argue, did say that. Then they say, okay, so we don't think he said that. We'll go to Paul and we'll interpret this way. And people, so I feel that if anything, that woman, for example, could equally say, and as the Lord said, if there's any people that are divorced here and remarried, then you are living in sin and you need to get your act together before you start condemning homosexuality. Now, that is the sort of thing I'm for, because that's trying to be much more consistent with the Bible texts. And so, because if they accuse pro-gay Christians of messing about with the Bible text, these people are ignoring the Bible text if you take a straightforward reading of Jesus on divorce. And if they want to sort of reinterpret Jesus' teaching on divorce, then fine. But then give credence for those that might be reinterpreting on the gay thing as well, because they're doing it. I think they're doing it. I think Mark anyway does say that you you shouldn't. Whereas Matthew says, except adultery, you know.
We had agonies. I think we're both in a similar situation, aren't we? Maggie was married and then divorced before she became a Christian and before she met me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean,
and so when we were going to get married in church and everything, and we treated these verses very seriously, and we looked them up with great care. And my understanding in the end was that, well, she wasn't a Christian when she did this sin, and becoming a Christian gives you a clean slate. So if she'd, as a Christian, done all that and disobeyed God and then expected him to kowtow when she wanted to get married again, that would have been quite a different situation to the one that we were in.
And yet I know tons of Christians who've got divorced and remarried as Christians. And so it's so common. I mean, it's just, maybe, I'm not sure if it's as common in the churches out, but I've certainly seen it in the common observation in my Christian life and observation of Christians. It's like, I don't really see the difference. This non-Christian or whatever. And so that's interesting. Now, didn't David Pawson, I think, lost his ministry at Minehead, I think, because he said something to this effect many, many years ago now about people being divorced were in sin, living. If they remarried, they have a sinful relationship. And it's something like that happened, I'm pretty sure. And he people were
his
caused the whole hoo-ha. He ended up having to not finish the talk, so I understand from what I read.
His son married a divorcee in church,
and did David
and they had nothing to do with it.
There we go. You see, so there's a conviction that might be consistent with the text, fine, and so he would obviously be against homosexuality.
So they got married. They're deep friends of ours, and they got married
because
did.
They would believe that they were living in a sinful marriage, because the first one is the only one that's valid. And I suppose a Catholic's view is very similar to that, isn't it? That, if you've been married once, you can't get married again. So all these marriages are null and void. I don't know many people who, I mean, you must know many Christians or a number of Christians that have got divorced as Christians and remarried.
Getting divorced, yes. I can't think of many who crassly just gone on and got married as if nothing happened. But I'm sure they
might be involved with somebody.
Yeah.
Well, that's again. That's not necessarily Christian either. And yet it's common. Believe me, it's common. And so the thing is, I think the point I'm trying to make here with homosexuality is Tony Campolo makes this point on the video that I did on the Views. He was saying, if you want to be biblical, he says, if you want to be biblical, those that are divorced and everything else, Jesus did mention it, and you're ignoring it. If you want to be, and now you say, now you're dividing the church over homosexuality, and Jesus didn't say it.
Yes. There's nothing more red letter than the teachings of Jesus.
But then, who's that? Did you see the video? If you saw the second one, who's that apologist that comes in after Tony Campolo?
Oh, okay.
Because it's the Calvinistic one, James. Oh gosh, he's very fundamentalist, but extremely James White, very intelligent, very scholarly. Fundamentalist. And Tony Campolo goes, so James White goes, and now if anybody tells you that Jesus did not mention homosexuality, is uninformed and ignorant, or ignorant and uninformed. And then I cut to Tony Campolo, who says, and Jesus said nothing about homosexuality. And the way I've cut it sounds like he's talking directly about him, ignorant and uninformed. And that's the video. So we will put that link in the end.
There's two wonderful videos, and we'll put them both in.
Well, what I'll do is we opened up with it. What I'll do is I'll end this show with a bit more of that video to hear the audio from the video. But if anyone listening wants to go to that YouTube channel, you can watch the 2 episodes that I did. Literally, I say a little bit, and then it's got different Christians of all sorts for or against homosexuality, between, absolute wrathful anger about homosexuality to sort of nuanced but against. And then you've got and the pro arguments and liberal Christian kind of views as well. And so it's all in there, and it sums up in one sense what we've been talking about this whole time.
Perfect.
So
can we, I think we've got time to talk about more of the kind of Christian shenanigans over all of this, and then when we've got Francis' expertise, we can go back to the kind of background culture stuff behind the Old Testament, and we can do a world tour of religion and same-sex marriage or same-sex relations, just so we can get a massive overview picture as well as your deep dive. There's another video I'd like to mention, which is on the BBC Sports website. It was put up about a couple of weeks ago, and it's to do with Catherine Brunt and Natalie Shiver, who are both in England's women's cricket team, and they got married last summer, and so they're now called Shiver Brunt, and everybody loves them, except they on this video, one of them is talking, and she talks about her devout Christian mum, and it just quoting, she doesn't accept she doesn't accept me for who I am, and she says I still love and visit my mum, but Natalie, her wife, is not a Natalie is not a person in my life when it comes to my family, she says. So that is the kind of influence of being a devout Christian on these sort of loving relationships as we see it as outsiders. And I would guess that this devout Christian mum would absolutely love to think that same-sex relationships are absolutely fine, and it's only the Bible that's causing her to be so, well, to us it feels, horrible, bigoted Christian. I guess as a real person she's not like that at all. She's just tied up in knots over what she feels God is saying in the Bible.
Well, I think there's a documentary possibly on it. I can't remember when and where now, but there's a documentary on about 6 families who had a child that turned out to be sort of lesbian or gay. And what was interesting is they were all Christian people. So it was seeing their journey, or I think all but one couple, if I remember rightly, all changed based on their own children being gay and then working with the text of the Bible. Because you had, what I can see now from where I stand, is your humanity at clash with theology and the Bible. Because when it's not you and you're out there and you're in church and you all think alike, you can go, yeah, it's a sin, or it's not right, or whatever. It's not what God's want. It's not God's ideal, or it's an abomination. But when it's your own child, you then see a cognitive dissonance kick in, because you know your child. You can't read Romans 1 and think of your child like that, generally speaking. You know what I mean? You just can't do it. And so what happens is that they tend to then go for these more progressive interpretations, or at least the Bible, you become more liberal, or you say the Bible, for then it was like the laws of the Old Testament we don't keep anymore. It was for then wrong, but now it's not. And you move on and you accept your child in a gay relationship and still be a Christian. This seems to be quite a common thing, except some people don't. They hold out, and some people have cut their children off, horror stories like that. Tony Campola mentions that there was interviews he did and the parents just completely cut off. There's one story where they sent him his passport all torn up or something, It's horrible stories. And at the end of the day, it's the religious book of the Bible that's doing this. It's forcing you to cut off your children in the extreme versions, or to adapt in the more, I would say, lovely versions.
Yes.
I've
got one more little anecdote stuff. This is Arzim, back to Ravi Zacharias Ministries. This chap called Simon Edwards. He gave a lecture in one of the weekends, and he kind of says you can take notes, but you mustn't sort of quote or anything. I'm going to explain why God thinks homosexuality in gay marriage is wrong.
Okay.
So he had loads of points, maybe 7 or 8. And there were things like the gay lifestyle being so unhealthy, sexually transmitted diseases being more prevalent, maybe even people talk about mental health issues. So we had all these reasons, and pretty well all of them. The idea was that these were reasons that you could talk to a non-Christian about, not just saying, well, God says no, so that's that. And all of them, they to me, pointed to gay marriage as the way out. So the gay lifestyle is a gay lifestyle because of the option of settling down and marrying and having a monogamous, loving, committed, supportive, healthy, close, long-term relationship hasn't been an option until the last 10 years or so, or maybe a bit longer. And so you'd say, well, if you really believe what you said, Simon, you'd be an advocate for gay marriage,
right?
And so he was only left with 1 or 2 points that he could even pretend to say was otherwise. I think like it being unnatural or something like that, which is all fairly thin gruel to me. If you're trying to actually say there is a reason why God, in his love for us, has prohibited this. Did you listen to the Unbelievable show about 10 days ago on exactly this topic? 2 views on LGBT and the church, Andrew Bunt and Charlie Bell.
No, I listened to the one again on Steve Chalk and this other guy, though, an old one on Unbelievable, but no, I didn't listen to that one 3 weeks ago. So what happened in that?
It was, they were very sensible. One of them is gay and decided to be celibate because that's what the Bible teaches. And the other one is a C of E vicar, and he's loyal to the church. He's not going to get married until the church says he can. But so he's living in a celibate but close relationship with another man, and advocating for the church to loosen up a bit more, but understands all the difficulties because it's the Church of England. And a couple of things struck me. One particularly was the celibate person. No, it was someone who called in. It was a show that had the guests all coming into the Zoom and asking questions. And one of the questions was about this friend who happened to be a friend of the celibate one, Andrew. And this friend said how he had accepted that he was going to be gay and single all his life, and he sort of sat on his kitchen floor and wept about it. And it was just a moment, and he happened to be sitting on his kitchen floor. It just gave this strong image of loneliness and what someone has to give up to follow Christ. And the response was, well, Jesus in Gethsemane, he also wept. It was sort of a bit like that. And I don't go with that at all, because Jesus was saving the world, whereas this person was just following the whims of someone who's got a bit old-fashioned views or something. Why is God asking them to be so? It's not you can't say, well, my suffering and heartache is all for a good cause, and look at this benefit that other people are getting out of it. The other point was how much they were bending over backwards to say how unclear it all is.
I see. Okay.
So one of them saying, well, I believe, that this is sinful and everything, but I couldn't possibly say that someone's going to hell if they have a close gay marriage as Christians. That's, above my pay grade sort of thing to say that. Yeah. So that was what the one who was advocating staying completely celibate was saying. And then the other one was saying, well, if Jesus was here, he would give us a clear answer, but he hasn't, and the answer isn't at all clear. And while it's unclear, I think I can sort of make my own path through this. So both of them were just saying as much as they could that God has sort of left us in the dark and left us complete mystery as what his view is.
Which is really, really, really interesting, and certainly in Protestant charismatic Christianity and maybe charismatic Catholics, which in fact you can talk to Jesus and he can talk to you.
Yeah.
That's always been my bugbear. Even when I was at university studying theology, I thought, you're in church and they say, Jesus can speak. It's not just you speak to Jesus and you hear nothing but complexity from the Bible. You can actually hear Jesus somehow say something to you. I feel the Lord is calling me to become a missionary, or he's saying to do this, or he's saying to do that. So how about throwing in, Lord, how do I read this passage? It's your word, and you expect Jesus to go, "You are reading it correctly, my son." Or it says, "I would look up John Collins, the Old Testament scholar." That's what I mean. There's a bizarreness somewhere. Sometimes I call it like the simplest childlike question. It's like you're taught that you can speak to God and He can speak to you back. And he can't. Because what you've just said there is two Christians, adult, mature, saying God has left us in the dark and we just have to work with what we've got with. And how about God speaking to you? Does He really speak to you? Well, it doesn't seem to, because look at the two of them. Look at anybody with any different view of the Bible. It's not settled by knowing God. It doesn't seem to me to be settled by knowing God. That's probably my biggest issue with Christianity. Is one of those points there.
And it seems that almost any topic there is going, Andrew can make a Christian diversity channel on it, giving
so many
different views.
I had about another 19 subjects on top of my 14 in view at the time, but things changed. I just didn't continue with it. But I wasn't for lack of diversity, and that diversity means that Jesus. Well, when he says if Jesus was here now as a human, he could answer it for us. But how about asking him in prayer for starters? But even then, that would only prove, you know what that would prove? It would prove Jesus would speak to them differently. Because often God thinks like us. So, but so
you're left with nothing really if you want to be a Christian and you're absolutely certain about something, because almost anything that you decide, I get to heaven by accepting the gospel. Oh, well, except in Matthew 25, it's by what you do for the least of these, you did for me. Almost on anything that you think is really important, there's lack of clarity. So we apologize that we've lost Francis, but
we've lost
Francis, be back with
us
next
to the other side.
So we'll have a deep dive next time and a wide sweep as well of the whole world.
Okay, so before we listen to another section of the YouTube channel that I made several years ago called Christian Diversity, we'll listen to another further section of the homosexuality Christian debate. In the meantime, I've been Andrew, your host,
and I've been Ed, and see you or listen to you next time.
Many today, like Matthew Vines, just basically say, well, Christians recognize they're no longer under the Levitical law, so these things just aren't relevant to us. Jesus taught anyone who teaches you to break even the least of these commandments is least in the kingdom of God. He said he did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill. Well, fulfill means do away with. No, it doesn't.
In the New Testament, Paul repeatedly and explicitly says that following Christ means no longer following the Hebrew laws of the Old Testament.
No, it doesn't.
I have to go with what the Bible say. And the Bible say it's an abomination.
When the term abomination is used in the Hebrew Bible, it is always used to address a ritual wrong. It never is used to refer to something innately immoral. Eating pork was not innately immoral for a Jew, but it was an abomination.
The evangelical community has gone ballistic over this issue. And they yell and scream, we've got to be biblical, we've got to be biblical, we've got to be biblical. We'd love to give ground on this, we'd love to be gracious, but we've got to be biblical. Well, if you're going to be biblical, then please excommunicate from every church in America that claims to be evangelical anybody who is divorced and remarried.
The Bible condemns divorce in no uncertain terms. Jesus says that those who divorce and remarry commit adultery. And so anyone in a second or third marriage would be a persistent adulterer. Adultery is a violation of the Ten Commandments. In fact, the Old Testament prescribes death for those who commit adultery. And yet, fundamentalists take a very different attitude toward the thrice married Newt Gingrich or the 4 times married Rush Limbaugh than they do toward same-sex couples.
When we are told that Jesus never addressed the issue of homosexuality, whenever you hear anybody say that, you are talking to an ignorant person, or a deceived person, or an ignorant deceived person.
Jesus never mentions homosexuality. I mean, if you want to see where he says, woe unto you, go to Matthew. It's over and over again against the Pharisees.
There is not a shred of evidence that anyone for centuries before or after Jesus ever promoted anything like what we're experiencing today. Why on earth would he address it?
And so that's why I think it's so important for us to not make the mistake of reading Romans 1 and say, isn't it clear?
You take pagan orgies in Romans 1 and say that's what God's saying to my friends that have been married.
I've been following this debate now for long enough where when one scholar puts out something, another will put out something, and then they'll put out something else, and it just keeps going. And I've been following it, and I've been realizing that for every response, there's an answer. For every answer, there's a response, and it just keeps escalating. And quite frankly, my head is hurting trying to follow the discussion.